Hi there guys, got a new video here for you today. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be rebuilding the FX AMP or AMP regulator. What I thought I'd do is I'd bring you along, share some tips and sort of what to look out for when rebuilding the regulators, and overall give you a good understanding of how to rebuild one properly. So this rifle is obviously a sub 12 air rifle, but the only difference between an FAC and a sub 12 rifle is the Belleville washers. Belleville washers on an FAC rifle are thicker, whereas the sub 12 rifles use thinner Belleville washers. Okay, so before we begin, the tools you're going to need to complete this job is number one, a good selection of Allen keys, nice good quality Allen keys. Number two, a set of O-ring picks, and number three, a way to remove the regulator piston from inside the body of the gun. What I use is one of these. This is a regulator piston removal tool, simply a press fit on the piston on one end and a loose fit on the other. And finally, if you plan on changing the regulator adjuster screw O-rings, which are these ones here, these two, you're going to need a tool to replace these O-rings. I use this, I call it a witch's hat, and it just aids replacing these two O-rings. I'll show you how that works in a little bit. Right, now that's all out of the way, we can begin. So firstly, what you're going to want to do is make a note of your regulator set pressure. This is the gauge on the back here. So on my rifle it's set to about 55 bar, as you can see by the gauge there. So I'll make a note of that so that we can set it to the same pressure once we're done rebuilding the rig. After that's done, we can degas the rifle. Firstly, we need to unscrew the bottle until we hear it bleed out. Okay, once that's unscrewed, you'll see that we still have reg pressure in the regulator. So this means the regulator piston is sealed. To degas this air, what we need to do is turn the power wheel to minimum and then dry fire the rifle in a safe place. And there you go. Rifle is now totally empty of air. So once that's done, we can remove the trigger guard. This is done by using a 2.5mm Allen key and removing these 4 bolts. Now, once the trigger plate's off, we can see the reg in the back of the block there. It's that brass thing at the base of the trigger. So we need to remove the trigger in order to gain access to the regulator. Easiest way to do this is to remove this trigger plate here. That's done by using a 2mm Allen key and just removing these screws. Once the trigger plate's removed, we need to remove this pin here. Easiest to do with a set of pliers, as long as you make sure that you're not scratching the block as you take the pin out. There it comes. Just pops off because of the spring. Once the trigger's out the way, we can see the regulator in the bottom there. Now in the UK, the regulator adjuster screw there is normally filled with a black plastic disc as a sort of anti-tamper to stop you adjusting the regulator. To remove this, what you need to do is get yourself a nice sharp pick or a needle of some kind and place the edge of the pick in one of the corners of the hex key. The anti-tamper that they use is round, so the edges of the hex key are normally open. What you can do then is push the pick in the side of the adjuster screw and pop the anti-tamper out. I've removed all the anti-tampers on my rifle, so unfortunately I can't show you me doing it. Now that that's out the way, we'll use a 2.5mm Allen key and remove the adjuster screw. Screw this all the way out you'll get to a point where it's not unscrewing anymore, and then you can simply pull the adjuster screw out. There it is there. Set that to one side. Next up, we need to remove the body. This is done by using a 5mm Allen key and unscrewing it. There it comes there. The Foster fitting on the end here is sometimes in the way, so just be careful as you're unscrewing. You can take these off, but they're very tight and I find it's easier not to bother. Sometimes a Belleville washer can be stuck to this face, so be careful as you take it out. Set that to one side. And finally we have the piston. That's in the bottom there. This is what we need our little tool for. So push the tool over the regulator piston and then remove it. In my rifle you'll note that I have a brass regulator piston, however in standard rifles they use a black Delrin one, as you can see there. However, the function of these regulator pistons is identical. Okay, once we have our piston out, we can set that to one side. There is an O-ring in the body of the rifle here, which I'll show you how to remove shortly. Also, as we've not got the trigger plate on here, what you'll need to be careful of is that the pins don't fall out as you put the rifle down. Okay, so here are the components all laid out nicely. In total we have 5 O-rings here. One of them is in the body and there is an additional one in the rifle. So 6 O-rings in total in the FX regulator. Before we start rebuilding, I thought I'd give you some examples of stuff to look out for when you're rebuilding your regulator. So the first, most obvious one is any damage to any of the O-rings. Each of the O-rings has a different job, and damage to any one of them can cause the regulator to misbehave. So the first thing to look out for is damage to any of the O-rings. The next thing to look out for is damage to the top of the regulator piston. I don't know how well the camera is going to pick this up, but this is a damaged piston. It has a deep dish in the top of the piston. This damage will inhibit the sealing of the adjuster screw against the piston and may cause regulator creep or inconsistencies. So when a piston has damage like this, it's time to replace it. Damage like this can be caused a number of ways. The most common is for people to adjust the regulator inwards when the rifle is pressurised. This causes the adjuster screw to screw down on top of this Delrin face and put a dimple in it. When the rifle is pressurised, you must never decrease the regulator pressure or screw in the regulator adjuster screw. If you need to go down in pressure, what you have to do is depressurise the rifle fully, so both the regulator and the air cylinder, then screw in the regulator, repressurise the rifle, then back the regulator screw out till you achieve the pressure that you want. However, damage like this can also occur over time. Obviously, regulator pressure is pushing against this side of the piston, which is forcing it against the regulator adjuster screw. So, after some time, this continued force puts a small dimple in the top. Another area to look for wear is scoring and scratches along the sides of the regulator piston. This is caused by the Belleville washers running up the piston and causing scratching to the Delrin. Again, this is normal and does occur over time, but if you see any deep scratches or scores, it's time to replace the regulator piston. The final place to look for wear and damage is on the regulator body itself. The two sealing surfaces are this OD on the outside here, so look on this to make sure there's no deep scores or scratches, and the second is in the bore. You can inspect the bore by holding it against the light and looking down this end and making sure there are no scratches or deep score marks in the bore. Scores or scratches in here can cause the regulator adjuster screw not to seal properly. This can cause creep and inconsistencies. Another thing to look out for is damage to the Belleville washers themselves. I've seen Belleville washers before that have come from the factory slightly kinked. A kinked Belleville washer won't work as well as a nice flat one like this one here. So look out for any marks or scratches or kinks in the Belleville washers and replace if necessary. One final thing I thought I'd mention is the Belleville washers here. This is a sub 12 air rifle, and so it uses thinner washers than would be present in an FAC rifle. The number and thickness of the Belleville washers vary slightly depending on what year and who you bought the rifle from. My rifle is a late Mark 1 and comes with 10.5mm thick washers. Some newer rifles are coming with thinner washers than this, so I've seen 0.35, 0.4 and 0.45s in modern irregulators, and sometimes they will have 11 washers instead of 10. So before you take the Belleville washers off your regulator piston, make a note of the orientation and the stack. On a final note, early FX rifles were fitted with a smaller AMP regulator. The difference in this regulator is that they used a smaller set of Bellevilles. The Bellevilles they used were smaller diameter and there was more of them. I believe also the regulator piston was of a different size. Now that's all out of the way, let's start rebuilding. So first off, I'm going to remove all the O-rings and replace them with brand new ones. You can find the sizes online, but just for your reference, the adjuster piston here uses 2x1 O-rings, and these O-rings have to be MBR 90s. This means they are slightly harder than standard O-rings. These have to be MBR 90s. You can't use MBR 70s on them, otherwise the adjuster screw won't seal properly in the regulator body. Next, the O-ring on the body here is a 7.5 by 2 MBR 70. The one located in the rifle in the main block is a 10 by 1.5, and again this is an MBR 90. And finally, the O-ring inside the regulator body and on the outside of the regulator piston is a 4 by 1.5 MBR 70. So we'll start off with the adjuster screw and work our way down. Now, before we start, I would say that these O-rings on the adjuster screw are extremely hard to replace. So if you don't have a tool and you can't see any noticeable damage to the O-rings, I would leave it as is. They are extremely hard to replace and you can end up breaking quite a few installing them if you don't have the tool. That being said, I find the easiest way to remove them is to cut them out with a scalpel. Now, you have to be extremely careful when removing the O-rings so that you don't nick or scratch or damage the regulator adjuster screw in any way. We just want to cut through the O-rings and remove them easily. Once we've cut through them, we should just be able to peel them off. Once the O-rings are off, we can give the adjuster screw a good clean. Okay, so I've given the adjuster screw a little clean there, nice and clean, ready for the new O-rings to be put back on. So, as I said before, these are 2 by 1 by MBR 90s. To reinstall them, I've got them sitting down here. What I do, put the little tool on, I call this a witch's hat, because it sort of looks like a witch's hat, and then what I do is I apply some silicone oil to the witch's hat just to make sure the O-rings slide across it easily. Just give it a coat there. So the first one going on the top there, what you can do is just stretch the O-ring over it, and you heard it pop in there. Just make sure it's not damaged and it's all in one piece, which it is. Then the next one to go on. This one's a bit more tricky as it has to ride over the previous O-ring, but with the witch's hat tool it's not too bad. It's much easier with fingernails. But there we go, there's the two O-rings successfully replaced. They look good, there's no damage to them, they should work well. And finally we just add a small drop of silicone oil to each O-ring. Then we can wipe the excess off with our fingers and it's ready to be put back in the rifle. Next up is the body. So firstly we're going to take the top one off, then we're going to take the one inside out. Now these ones are a bit easier to remove and replace than the adjuster screw ones. What I do is I'll get the O-ring pick underneath the O-ring and then just lift it over the face, like so. For the one inside the bore, you can do a similar thing using an O-ring pick. I like to use a pointy one for this. What we can do is get in, stab the O-ring, making sure not to damage the sealing faces in there. Obviously we're going to be replacing the O-ring, so it doesn't matter if the O-ring gets damaged. Hook it out of its seat. As you can see there, it's become slightly unseated. Then we can just push it through using something nice and soft, like a wooden toothpick, like this. Just push it out the end. And there it comes. So same thing with the regulator body, we'll give it a good clean, and then we'll replace the O-rings. So there we are, nice and clean. What I do, so I just scrub the outside with a toothbrush so that it removes any grit, any grime that's present on the regulator body, and then I go into the bore using a cotton bud. Just press it through, give it a nice clean swish round inside. Get rid of anything that might affect the working of the regulator. So first off we'll replace the body one, and this is a 7.5 by 2 MBR 70. So we'll just push it on there, then stretch it over the rim, like so. And we'll give that a small drop of silicone oil. Like so. Next up is the one in the bore here. This one can be a bit trickier as it's an internal O-ring. What I found is easiest is to squeeze the O-ring, get it started in the hole. Then push the side down, get it in line with the seat. Then using a wooden toothpick you can seat one side of the O-ring, and then from the other side push the O-ring down, and you should get something like this. It's seated on both sides now, it's just this lump sticking out. Then what we can do is push the lump down and it should go in there nicely. You can see it's all sealed. Then just a drop of silicone oil, like so. This is the piston, as I said before. This is a brass one that's in my rifle. I made this. This is one I made a little while ago, just as a little upgrade part. But changing the O-ring between this one and a plastic one is identical. Now you notice I've taken the Belleville washers out. They're nicely stacked to one side, nice and safe. So to remove this, what you're going to need is an O-ring pick. What I found easiest is to squeeze each side of the O-ring and make a little mound. As you can see there, it bulges out a little at the side. Get our pick underneath it, like so. Being nice and careful not to scratch or score the outside faces, and just pull the O-ring off like so. This O-ring is a 4 by 1.5 and it's the same one that goes in the end here. To put it back on, just put it in the seat as so, then stretch it over the outside, nice and easy. Then finally add a little drop of silicone oil and wipe the excess off. So that's all the external components changed. The last one is the O-ring inside the gun. So I'll bring that back. So here's the rifle back, and I don't know how well the camera's going to see that, but there is a black ring in the body there. What we need to do is get that out and change it. So it's going to be probably impossible for me to show for the camera, but what I do is use a nice sharp pick, put it in the body of the rifle, pierce the O-ring, being careful not to scratch any of the surfaces in there, and then lever the O-ring out. So I'll see if I can do it for the camera, but chances are you won't be able to see what's going on anyway. Right, so I think I got the O-ring unseated there. Yep, it's unseated as you can see. There it is there. So replacing it is just as tricky, but I'll try and show it for the camera. This is a 10 by 1.5 MBR90 and it needs to go in the block. So before we put it in, small amount of silicone oil on the O-ring. I found this helps a little and allows it to slide into the seat a bit easier. So I find squeezing it and just pushing it down to, what I found is if you offset the O-ring slightly so that it's closer to one side than the other, you can see where the O-ring has to go in the seat. What you can do is using something soft like a toothpick end, you can gently push the O-ring into the seat. So you might be able to see there that one side of the O-ring is in the seat. Normally once you get it started it's pretty easy to just push on one side and get the other side seated. Just work it down nice and slowly until you seat the entire O-ring. And there we have it there. You can see the O-ring seated all the way around, no problem. It's a bit tricky, but once you do one or two you get the hang of it, it's not too bad. So you can see there's a little excess silicone oil in the bottom there, so I'm just going to clean that out with a cotton bud. Okay, so there we go, nice and clean, ready for the piston to be put back in. The final thing to do is to just clean the Belleville washers. Now it's important to keep them in the same pairs as they were, as they are sized, and it's important to get two of the same size together as a pair. If you do accidentally mix them up, what you can do is measure the thickness of the Belleville with a set of calipers and pair them up that way. The order in which they are stacked once they are paired doesn't seem to make that much difference. However, from standard, this rifle had the weakest or thinnest Belleville washers at the base of the regulator piston. So here's the piston. This end would have the weakest springs and this end would have the strongest or the thickest springs. So that's just something to keep in mind. I will say these Belleville washers are polished, that's why you can see the shiny edge on them. I've covered Belleville polishing in my Leshy 2 reg rebuild video, so I won't go over it here. However, what I like to do before I put the Belleville washers back on the piston is just add a small amount of dry lube to each of the Bellevilles to make sure they've got some lubrication as they slide across each other. And this is it here. What I like to do with this, it's a powder. I like to just give the Bellevilles a little dusting. Then once it's on them, just give them a little rub to spread the dry lube evenly. Now this dry lube does get everywhere, so it's important to put a little tissue down or something to stop it from travelling onto the work surface. Once they're all dry lubed up, you can then restack the washers onto the piston. There you are there. So I'll set that to one side. And there we have it, a fully rebuilt reg ready to be installed back into the rifle. So I'll bring back the rifle, then we'll put the regulator back in. Okay, here's the rifle back. So the first thing we need to do is install the regulator piston. I'm going to use my regulator piston tool and just put it in the loose end. Now I find it's easiest to insert the piston from the bottom, which is hard to show for the camera, but like there. When pushing the piston in, you've got to do it slowly and you'll feel the piston pop into the O-ring seat. Right, once that's in there, before putting the body in, what I like to do is just add a little silicone oil to this outside edge here. Just a small amount. All this does is allow the O-ring to ride up this face more easily. This doesn't have to be ultra super tight, so just a quick nip with the Allen key will be enough. Then lastly, time to just pop the adjuster screw back in the rifle. And screw it down. What I do is I screw it down until I feel it lightly touch the end of the piston, like that, then back it off a quarter turn. We'll set the reg pressure when the rifle is pressurised. So before we pressurise the rifle, what I like to do is just reinstall the trigger. So reinstalling the trigger is easy. As before, it's just this pin here. So what we can do, put the trigger in, making sure the spring sits in its little seat at the back of the sear there. Then line the Pac-Man wheel up with the pin and push it in, like so. Trigger's in there, we can put the trigger plate back. You can leave the trigger off. It does make it easier to adjust the regulator pressure in here, but I find it's always best to do a little adjusting, then a dry fire or two just to help the regs settle. So when I rebuild them, I reinstall the trigger. Okay, now that that's done, we can repressurise the rifle. Okay, you can see from the gauge the rifle's pressurised. However, the reg isn't showing any pressure. So what we need to do is, using an Allen key, it's easiest to use a ball end for this. Insert it into the regulator adjuster screw and just back it out, quarter turn at a time, until we near our set pressure. So that's about 40 bar on the gauge. What I'm going to do now is just do a couple dry fires to settle the reg down. And as you can see by the regulator pressure gauge, we've settled down to about 35 bar. So what I'll do is I'll keep adjusting and shooting till we reach the 55 bar that this gun was set at before we rebuilt the regulator. Okay, as we can see there, we set the regulator pressure at 55 bar. What it was set before we rebuilt the reg. Once the rifle's rebuilt and we're happy with the regulator set pressure, we can reinstall the trigger guard. Okay, now that the rifle's rebuilt, it's time to do a couple things. Number one, check your power. Make sure you're still under the 12 foot-pound limit. And number two is to check your consistency. Now, you can't expect miracles right away as we've just rebuilt everything. The regulator needs time to settle down and to rebed itself in. What I normally do when I've rebuilt a rifle is, number one, check the power, and then put 100 to 150 shots through it without even looking at a chronograph. Once I've got a few shots through it, then I start looking at the chronograph and making sure we're nice and consistent. I normally test my rifles over an entire magazine, and I would call anything under 20 feet per second extreme spread over the entirety of a magazine to be pretty good. Any lower spread than that and you need to start weighing pellets and sorting them and sizing them, and I can't be bothered with all that, so I just call anything under 20 good. And if you really want to test your rifle, you can do an entire shot string over the entire fill of the rifle. So whatever you fill your rifle at, say 200, down to reg pressure, and see your spread then. That, I believe, is the only true way to test the consistency of the rifle. But that's about it from me, guys, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.